In 1967, you have Dr. King starting to look at other deeper, more widespread aspects of white supremacy. And he started to look at the question of urban poverty and urban racism and Black communities in all these cities across the country. And then you had rebellions happen in Newark, New Jersey, and in Detroit, Michigan in 1967. He said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And it was almost like he was giving a speech preparing for martyrdom. And I don't know what indications he had or what fears he had, where the fears came from, but that speech was clearly prophetic.
Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on?
Welcome to the Roots and Roots podcast, where we talk about power, where it comes from, how it's built, and how everyday people shape history through collective action. We'll be exploring politics, culture, and movements that have shaped democracy. We are your co-hosts, Ansay and Eric Robertson, and we're so excited to have you join us for our very first episode. In honor of MLK Day, today we'll be discussing how Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday finally became a federal holiday. And yes, it took 15 fucking years. We'll talk about hush puppies. We'll break down what pushed Rep. John Conyers Jr. to introduce the bill to make MLK's birthday a federal holiday, how fed up sanitation workers sparked the 1968 Memphis strike, and give Stevie Wonder his flowers for the happy birthday song and why it matters to MLK's legacy, and other random facts that might pop into our head as we go. So I'm super excited that this is happening. What up, E? How are you feeling this new year?
What is going on? The horrors persist.
The long national nightmare.
You know, no matter how awful shit gets, there's just always the story of the people pushing back. There's always the story of people finding ways to resist. Even in the most oppressive environments, people find ways to get together and to try to make things better in some way, right? And I just feel like that's the moment we're in right now. It's just these fascist sons of bitches are just doubling down, tripling down, atrocity after atrocity after atrocity, murder, imperialism, just all kinds of danger. And yet you still see people sticking together, figuring out ways to start to undermine the things that are propping up all of these atrocities. And I'm on the one hand constantly enraged, but on the other hand filled with this profound sense of hope, because I just feel like the people are rising up to protect each other and take care of each other all over this country. So shout out to everybody out there fighting the good fight and standing up right now.
100%.
Fuck ICE.
Fuck ICE. Melt ICE. Well, fuck ICE. Fuck Trump. Fuck everybody who thinks this shit is okay.
Just, man, the fuck the fascism. Fuck the, just anyway. One of the things that I wanted to bring out when I'm talking about like the finding ways is we're watching ICE just all over the country, just going after people, invading people's homes, invading communities, locking people up regardless of whether or not they're undocumented or documented, murdering people in the streets who are in even the slightest ways are standing up. People are being killed for standing up against ICE. And there are right now over 1,000 actions happening this weekend protesting ICE, and the fact that they killed a woman this past week named Renee Good in Minnesota. And I think that has just turned things up across the country. And it's always such a tragic thing, but it's a reality that these the things that horrify and shock people is sometimes the thing where you feel like people finally get pushed into action on some bigger scale and start to move the dial. And I'm just hoping that this is one of those moments, because they are attacking the people everywhere, and we've just got to find ways to, like I said earlier, to stand up. And one of the ways that I heard this week that just made me, it's a good story, and people need the good stories to, you need them to keep you going right now, is there's an airline called Avelo Airlines, and it a while back got the contract to do deportation flights for ICE, meaning they got the government contract to take people that ICE was deporting and fly them into the detention centers and deport them and all that stuff. And people found out that they had gotten this contract with ICE, activists, different community organizations, and all over the country there was a campaign against Avelo to demand that they stop contracting with ICE and stop providing the flights for this deportation system that is just committing, crime after crime after crime, deporting people all over the country. And it was one of these ways that people felt like they could somehow weaken the deportation machine. And so there was a campaign in all the cities that Avelo does business, including Atlanta, where these protests happened at the airport terminals, and basically embarrassing Avelo, putting pressure on city officials to pressure Avelo. And just this last week, Avelo bent the knee and announced that they were going to stop contracting with the government to carry out these deportations. And I just want to say, hats off.
I love it.
To all the people who did that work out there of just putting all that heat on Avelo. And it's just proof that if you pick a target and you have a strategy, and you pick the good tactics and you figure out how to maximize your pressure, that you can actually win things. And I just think it's just a great example. Obviously, there's just all kinds of everything is still very bad and very ominous, but the victories are important, and we need to celebrate them and acknowledge them. So hats off to everybody for that win.
I need you to speak to the cynic in me, Eric, because one of the things that I personally am struggling with, like not necessarily as an organizer, but just as a person, as a human in my body and in my heart parts, like contending with the fact that like we don't care about bad things happening to people of color in the same ways that we do if in an instance where like bad things happen to white folks and particularly white women. Like I'm looking at the response to Renee Good, and like rest in peace, and I know that like she definitely woke up today thinking like, how can I contribute, and like how can I make my community safer, like what can I do to link up with my neighbors, and not like I'm gonna die today, and Pooter Porter Jr. was shot by ICE on New Year's Eve, right, in Chicago. I'm definitely gonna be here, right? I'm definitely coming to the function, but I need a message, brother. Talk to me, because it's really hard to not believe that until harm happens to white folks and white folks like really contest with power for their own sake and their own safety or in defense of us all, it's hard for me to see how we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, to me, it's like that's the $50 million question, right? Is America, the whole story of America is a story of white folks being like a critical mass of white folks being offered up elements of privilege in order to keep their mouth shut, basically, right? That you're going to have the more peaceful life. You're going to have just a slightly better life because you're white, right? And I think that is the sort.
And if you shut the fuck up.
Keep your mouth shut, just go on, get along. The other side of that story is that whenever white folks chose to align themselves with the struggles of the oppressed, whether it be with Native Americans, whether it be with enslaved people, in solidarity in the South in particular, those folks were murdered pretty much like for decades. And then they decided to use the carrot instead of the stick, at a certain point when they were trying to get poor white folks to be on the side of the rich white folks. So I'm just making that point to say this is a long story of trying to move white folks at scale away from being aligned with people who were oppressing everybody. We've seen movement, at different points in history. It's always about movements of people. It's not about necessarily, white people deciding to be good people, right? I mean, that happens. I mean, that does happen on some micro level, but in terms of what actually moves people and what we've seen in history that people have moved is when you can find a commonality that supersedes the privilege or the mutual non-aggression pact that you've engaged in with these rich assholes. And in the case of what we're talking about today, is one of the examples, the Memphis sanitation strike, which Dr. King spent his last days coming to offer support to, was an example of how people collectively don't have money, don't have social power, don't have economic power, don't have the ability to pay anybody off, can't bribe people, don't have lawyers, are able to come together and change their own circumstances. And I think that's the history of the world is not individual, great people. It's actually millions and millions of people that come together and change history. Let's just think about what the context was like for the Memphis workers in 1968. They were Black workers living in the Jim Crow South who were working in what is still to this day the fourth most dangerous job in the country, a job that's more dangerous than a police officer and a firefighter. And that's after you have all kinds of safety regulations in America today. So you can imagine what it must have been like to be.
Wow. Wait. Sanitation workers have a more dangerous job than cops?
Absolutely. 100%. And firefighters. Think about that. People who run into burning buildings.
Okay.
Have a less dangerous job, have less injuries, less fatalities than sanitation workers.
Wow.
And so if you think about 1968, Black workers living in a Jim Crow town, they had it pretty bad. They had it really bad. I mean, this is a job that was probably one of the few jobs that you were allowed to have as a Black worker that engaged with the public in Memphis, and these workers were just degraded and treated like they were subhuman. They weren't allowed to object in any way at all if something unfair, some decision, some discipline was handed down that they didn't like. If they spoke up at all, they got fired, right?
Wow.
And if they tried to address any kind of safety thing that happened, they basically were told, if you don't like it, get out, go find a job somewhere else. And so these folks were really kind of in a difficult position. And in 1966, they decided they were going to try to get a union, try to organize a union so that they could have a union contract, and a union contract that would give them some say in their working conditions, allow them to negotiate over raises and wages, and would have a grievance procedure where they would be able to deal with like unfair discipline and have some resolution, some way to address all the things, all the problems and all the bad working conditions and all the racism that they were experiencing from their employer, the city of Memphis.
Yeah.
These folks were living under the poverty level. I mean,
what was the poverty level then? Do you know?
So yeah, it was $3,000 a year was the poverty level, if you can imagine.
And they were below that.
They made below that.
Such crazy work.
So you're literally risking your life for this job that you could not actually pay all your bills.
From the record, and some of the sanitation workers who are still alive to this day, we understand that they described it as a nasty ass job, that the garbage had water in it, it had maggots in it. Back before, we have Herbie Kirby's now, but back in the day, they had basically like these garbage tins, these metal garbage tins, and they had to take it and pour it into another one, or take it and manually pour it into the truck, which means that oftentimes, I'm African. The easiest way to carry really heavy things is to put it on your head, right? Like millennia of human evolution have taught us that, right? That it's the most efficient way to carry heavy loads across distances. And so putting a giant garbage pail on your head makes sense for the physics of it, but what it also means is that you leaking trash water down your face and down your back and down your neck. And because people didn't have jobs, right, or people didn't have cars, my bad, that sometimes you had to get on public transportation to get home after work, right, and that you had to go home smelling so bad that they wouldn't even let you ride the bus. And so, and it was a job that was necessary, right? That if they don't pick up your trash for a month outside of your house, people are going to notice, right? Henry Loeb was the mayor of Memphis at the time. Real class act. Kind of a terrible human being. Did not want to acknowledge their ask. Right? That by this time on February 1st, 1968, two Memphis sanitation workers, Echol and Robert Walker, were killed by a faulty garbage truck. Eric, because I know that you know this story, how is it even that the garbage truck could it lead to the end of sanitation workers' lives at that time? What was the demand? What was happening? How did they die?
So first of all, you got to understand what these trucks are. They have a compactor that packs the trash. Like when they dump the trash in, it gets. I used to represent sanitation workers as a business agent for the Teamsters. So I'm
shout out to
not
the Teamsters.
That much of a nerd. I'm not that much of a nerd. I just happen to know a lot about trash. Okay,
you are absolutely that much of a nerd. What are you saying?
Yeah, I am. Okay. So, but these trucks were designed so, you dump some trash in and then a packer would come down and push that trash into a bigger part of the truck, right? And now, and there are safety things on trucks that prevent people from getting in. If you get in the back, it has to be, stopped. But back then it was much more. So these two workers, it was raining, and one of the racist Jim Crow aspects of this job was that the sanitation workers were not allowed to go inside buildings or go into people's porches or anything when it started raining. They were literally told to go jump in the back of their truck to get out of the rain. to get in where the trash is and just get out of the rain. So these workers were being told to just do this just gross, humiliating thing of having to get into the back of a truck, like they've had to do probably many times before. And that compactor on the trash truck activated and crushed and killed these two workers.
And people were pissed about it. The city of Memphis did nothing about it. That people, you will hear me say this time and time again. People are far too comfortable in this country and globally with Black suffering, with Black death. And so these sanitation workers were killed by the oppressive and horrible racist conditions of their jobs. They appealed to their boss, the mayor, and the mayor did nothing, said nothing, cared nothing, offered nothing to his employees, to these workers who were killed by their jobs. So on February 12th, 1968, 1,300 workers went on strike and they let the trash sit.
I just don't know if people understand how nasty that shit is. Like when trash workers go on strike, and because what people don't understand about trash work and sanitation workers is they are public health workers. Because if you don't remove the trash, disease and all kinds of just dangers start to develop because of that. Rodents and vermin and just all kinds of just everything. That is one of the hallmarks of civilization. This strike was solid, and they shut that trash pickup down. And that is one of the most striking things about the Memphis sanitation strike is when you were talking about Mayor Loeb, his contempt and disregard for Black life is just striking, but it's also just probably pretty much the status quo, right? I mean, Black people being murdered by the police and all these things. Those are just little blips that may make it into the newspaper at that time in history. Maybe, probably not though, you know? And so the idea that Black workers all of a sudden were saying, hey, our lives, this, in many ways, this may have been, you know, there's been other iterations of this, but this is another iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is telling these city people that you are not going to disregard our death. We are going to be able to protect ourselves. And they drew the line, and they used one of the characteristics of that, again, is these atrocities happen, and that becomes a catalyst for something for workers to decide that they've had enough and to use that to accomplish the things that they've been fighting for for 2 years. And that is, you know, to get a union contract and to get the protections of a union contract and to get a grievance procedure and to have the ability to negotiate with their boss across a table and that boss having to negotiate with them. That's what they were fighting for.
We got February 1st, Echol and Robert were killed. February 12th, the sanitation workers go on strike. By the time we get to March 5th of 1968, the AFL-CIO, or the AFL, so the National Federal Federation sort of workers, this sort of umbrella organization of all kinds of unions in this country, had organized a multiracial group of supporters and organizers who went out and picketed. 117 protesters were arrested. HBCU students, shout out to Memphis State, started singing and chanting, and they escorted the protesters to jail that day. And so the support for the striking sanitation workers was beginning to grow. The community was beginning to show up and turn up. And it was starting to get national attention.
I want to just point out the sort of why these HBCU students felt the need to march to jail with these folks who had been arrested. Because in the Jim Crow South, it was very common for police officers who were taking people to jail to not end up going to the jail, to take a detour and go and do something horrible to the people who they've arrested. And so these folks were escorting these folks to jail to make sure they actually made it to jail.
Yeah.
And because the reality was lynch mobs were just a fact of life in Jim Crow South. And this would have been one of those moments where you could absolutely have seen these rednecks, doing something horrible to those people who had been arrested. That's 117 people.
Yeah. And even in our so-called nation of laws, right? In this moment, we have seen law enforcement act lawlessly all the time. And the city was on fire at that time, right? So again, word of the strike had spread. Their support was growing. National folks who are not even from Tennessee, were coming into the state. Bill Lucy, founder of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and a leader in AFSCME, and one of our greatest labor leaders and civil rights leaders in our country, was assigned to the Memphis Sanitation Local at the time, Local 1773. Shout out to y'all. The city was on fire. And so, yeah, absolutely. HBCU students, babies, singing, chanting, putting eyes on protesters and letting the law enforcement know, not these folks and not this time. Unfortunately, I feel like it's still a thing that needs to be done, especially as we see how lawlessly ICE acts. I mean, I hesitate to call them law enforcement because there's nothing legal about what they're doing. They're enforcing a system of murder, violence, death, xenophobia, racism, wealth extraction. But it ain't laws that they're enforcing. And so I'm feeling these HBCU students in this moment, these Memphis State students, and sitting with what it actually takes, how we actually keep our community safe, how we actually go about protesting in a way. And I think that there is a way to do it. I mean, there's several ways to do it. I would never be so prescriptive, right? But it is confronting. There's confrontation here, right? They're saying no here. They're saying we do not accept what is happening, and the demand is front and center, and people's humanity is front and center. And I appreciate that thread and that the connectivity between now and 1968.
Absolutely. So all this is going on in Memphis, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you have the civil rights movement has just exploded across the country, beginning in the early 60s. And by this time, you had already seen things like the battle in Birmingham with the hoses and Bull Connor and all that. You've seen the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed. You saw the whole the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. You've seen Jim Crow segregation begin to be addressed. And in 1967, you have Dr. King starting to look at other deeper, more widespread aspects of white supremacy. And he started to look at the question of urban poverty and urban racism, and the Black communities in all these cities across the country. And then you had rebellions happen in Newark, New Jersey, and in Detroit, Michigan in 1967. And what that did for Dr. King is it gave him an idea that like he understood that the situation in these inner cities had become so intolerable that people are just on the precipice of rebellion. The rebellions that happened in Newark and Detroit happened in reaction to incidents of police brutality. And so Dr. King, there's a quote from Dr. King where he says, a riot is the language of the unheard. And Dr. King heard them, right? In April 1967, Dr. King was at this Southern Christian Leadership Conference retreat. And in reaction to the rebellions in Newark and in Detroit, he proposed that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference develop a poor people's campaign that incorporated an economic bill of rights for low-income Americans that would address the pervasive inequality and poverty that was present in urban centers like Detroit and Newark. Also, Dr. King was also starting to make all these other connections, right? He delivered a speech called Beyond Vietnam, where he started to make the connections between imperialism and racism and economic exploitation. And so he was moving very rapidly because he had seen that the racism that he had fought to address in the Jim Crow South was different, but it was just as pervasive all across the country. It was, and the structural aspect of it, was just all throughout American society. And so he began to make all these connections, and then the strike happened in Memphis, and Dr. King saw that as a critical opportunity to go and to begin to address the issues of economic inequality and poverty and racism and how they were connected. And so he went to Memphis.
Love it. So then March 18th, right? He makes his way to the Mason Temple and delivers his All Labor Has Dignity speech. And this is an example of what you were pointing out, right? That they had founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was starting to be more intersectional in his analysis, that he was a civil rights leader and an organizer around civil rights, but it was economic rights. It was connecting to the labor movement. It was connecting to peace. He was connecting to the environmental movement. Like, he was growing in his analysis and bringing broader swaths of society together in defense of like good living for Black people, but for all workers.
Right. And one of the interesting things about it is when you were talking about white people's consciousness, this is a good example of Black workers fighting for the rights that were going to end up benefiting white workers, and huge swaths of, white racists who were not rich people were, hated those strikers and thought that they were being, asking for too much. How dare they ask for something that I don't have the guts to ask myself for, is essentially what was going on, I think, in the minds of white racist working class people. Is they get mad because they feel like, well, how dare a Black person demand something that I don't have the guts to demand for myself?
That is some supreme hating ass shit.
That's some bootlicker shit, ain't it?
It's disgusting. Like, I don't have the courage to ask for the things that I need. I don't have the courage to live in my values. And so instead of attacking the people who are stealing the value of my labor, right, that I would actually go after my comrades, like people who are materially linked to me, closer to me, go after them for saying enough. And I go after them for saying, ouch, that hurts, right? Disgusting.
White supremacy is one hell of a drug.
It's one hell of a drug.
It is.
One of the things that I find interesting, though, from this story is, was there escalation? How the people in Memphis were responding to it? What were middle class Negroes doing at the time, and people with access to resources? What were the white folks, and particularly the wealthy white folks, doing and saying at the time? Yeah, because this is becoming more and more difficult to ignore. And mind you, trash is still piling up.
You know, one of the first things to really talk about is Dr. King organized a march to support the workers, and on March 28th. And that march was attacked by the police. And Dr. King was almost crushed by his own folks trying to, get out of the way of the police. And that really shook Dr. King, because there was a chunk of young people who did not take the attack of the police and react nonviolently. They defended themselves and engaged in what would probably, broke some windows and whatnot. And that really shook Dr. King, because he had been able to, in the past, always maintain discipline at the protests that he had led. And he had always understood that when that violence happened by the police, that was something that strategically he saw that you reacted nonviolently to, and through, civil disobedience tactics or whatnot. And these young folks were not about that and decided to defend themselves.
The thing that this makes me think of is the story that you told earlier about, rest in peace, our comrade Good, in Minneapolis, that police actually escalated it, right? So
Absolutely.
They were in the middle of a strike. They had been at it for weeks. Martin Luther King and other clergy were out there, right? People are upset, and they're growing increasingly upset. And King almost got crushed because the police were blocking the way and blocking access, right? And that also escalated tensions and led to people dying and people being hurt. Where have we heard that recently?
I mean, it's like the story of our time, right? Is the forces of the state provoking people by doing things that are outrageous, and then blaming those people and assassinating their character for daring to say, no, you're not going to club me in the head.
You're just not. You're just not. I'm not going to, and if you are, I'm not going to be happy about it. I'm not going to be quiet about it, for sure.
No, and if you're going to club me in the head, I'm going to smash this window, Right. Dr. King's reaction to it was he was struggling with it, because he also understood that these young people were part of the sort of new development that was happening among, a radicalization that was happening among groups of young people that people called gangs, right? And so the invaders were the group of young people, and they were going through a similar evolution as you saw in other places like Oakland, California, with the Black Panther Party, or the in New York with the Young Lords, where you had organizations that were sort of urban youth who came together and started to think in revolutionary terms, right? Mm-hmm. And so they were sort of part of that, and it was sort of the beginnings of that. And it was in Memphis, right? So it's like it was sort of shocking. And those types of things had not happened in the civil rights movement in the South. This was so. Dr. King was really struggling with how to move forward, and the critical thing to always think about and look at that is Dr. King was looking for a way to find some way to come to an agreement with those young people, and to find a way to find a common way of working together, and he struggled with that up until he was assassinated.
youth demands have always been oftentimes much closer to the thing that we actually need. I think it's why our movements must be multi-generational, right? That like there's wisdom and strategy in understanding the past and what happened, but there's a sort of boldness about youth, and sort of there's a truth, and maybe it's because they haven't yet learned to negotiate against themselves, right? Like they still have the audacity to believe that we could win, and the audacity to ask for the things that they actually want. Like my nephew asking me for a pair of Balenciaga sneakers so he could go back to the 7th grade and stunt on his homie. I don't have Balenciaga sneakers. What are you saying to me right now, bruh? Right? And so I think that, yeah, there's absolutely tension, and the young people turning up on the clergy and the elders and saying, y'all see what the fuck is going on. Y'all see what's happening outside. This is what we need to be doing. We're not backing down, right? That youth energy, that youth arrogance, that youth clarity, challenged, the Southern Christian leadership, the AFSCME leadership, the AFL-CIO leadership, and continues to challenge us today. And we need it. We need it.
Absolutely. There are moral compass. I mean, I mean, it all has to be cycled through, what is the correct strategy? What is the correct tactics and all those kinds of things, and having honest and discussions about what that looks like, but at the end of the day, you ignore young people at your own peril, because
and you ignore elders at your own peril.
That's right.
Like they've been there before. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Oh man. I mean, most of my life was spent being a dumbass. I mean, like, I mean, you're gonna think you have all the answers. That's one of the aspects of being young, I think.
But that's my argument for collective action, collective learning, right? Collective being, and multiracial and multi-generational, right? That there's value to what Gen Z brings to our movements now, for sure. And for the boomers and Xers and millennials who don't see themselves as bootlickers, but who are a part of the unbroken chain of world builders, like they know some things too. And so it feels really important that as we lock in individually, because we have made the decisions for ourselves that we will not go quietly into the night, that as we do that, like we find our community, you find your people, because there's lessons in there, there's wisdom strategy, there's the game in there, but there's also safety in there. Back to the Memphis State students you were talking about, right?
That's right.
117 people were protesting and got arrested. HBCU students came to sing This Little Light of Mine and We Shall Overcome, and escorted them and made sure that they all got there, because our safety comes in our community as well.
That's right. One of the strategic reasons for the nonviolent approach that Dr. King advocated was that it made it harder to, at least it took one more tool out of the toolbox of people who are trying to repress your movement, right? And at least in theory, right? And so in reaction to the provocation of the police, which caused, a kerfluffle at their previous march, the city got a federal injunction and delivered it to Dr. King and his team of very famous other people. One of my heroes, James Orange, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, everybody but
Ralph David Abernathy.
Abernathy, all these people were present, and they all get a federal injunction saying you can't march anymore. You can't do this march.
When was that?
Because Dr. King had decided, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do another march, and I'm not going to let the challenges of this multifaceted movement that's coming into being here, I'm not going to let that stop us from building the movement we need to win justice for these sanitation workers. So he planned another march, and on April 3rd, they got this injunction, this federal injunction saying, you're not going to march. You can't march. We're saying you can't march. And that's always a gut check for movements. And it's the labor movement, all these mass movements of, if you get an injunction saying you can't march, that's sort of like saying, you know, throwing down the gauntlet, right? And you're like, okay, are we going to march, or are we going to let them repress us, right? And just with a piece of paper. And, you know, so Dr. King was in the process of still going through with his plan to go forward with the march. And then on April 3rd, he did a rally where he gave what we now know as the Mountaintop speech. And that was one of the most ominous and sort of chilling speeches I've ever listened to in my life.
What makes it so ominous?
Well,
Words are hard.
You got this sense that Dr. King was like foretelling his own death.
Okay.
And so when, you know, one of the quotes that's really the one that just made you hits you when you hear him say it in the speech, he said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And it was almost like he was giving a speech preparing for martyrdom. And I don't know what indications he had or what fears he had, where the fears came from, but that speech was clearly prophetic. And it's one of these things where you always constantly wonder why he made that speech the way he did, why he had that sense that something bad was coming.
So April 3rd, he preached the house down at the Mason Temple. Like, witnesses and folks who were there said that he got back to the pew like he had given his all. And, you know, he, I guess, had been known for, like, you know, dropping the mic and walking back to his, like, distinguished speaker seat with dignity. They said he had to be carried back to the pew, and he just dropped, right? That he was so, like, locked in, and again had just given it all in the April 3rd speech. So then they wake up at 8 a.m. on April 4th. They say he's at the Lorraine Motel, room 306. He's in good spirits. He's discussing plans for the march that they have rescheduled for April 8th, right? So injunction comes on April 3rd. He wakes up on April 4th and was like, light work. We're doing this march, and it's going to happen on April 8th. We pushed it back a little bit, but it's happening on April 8th, right? 10 a.m. He's meeting with the SCLC staff. Staff is coming in, local organizers, so folks from Memphis, right? Because again, the news had spread. Like, now you got national famous civil rights organizers here. The clergy are coming in and out of the room, right? People are they're strategizing, they're preparing, they're, like, you know, it's also social.
Doing all the things you do before you're having a big ass march.
Doing all the things that you do before you have a big ass march. And you and I have both, like, led marches, like, planned them, organized them. And so, like, I feel this, like, there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of activity, people are getting their assignments, like, shit's happening everywhere, speeches are getting written and rewritten, you're negotiating speaking lineups because Pastor Hardbottoms it was like, you know what I'm saying, why is Pastor Ascot speaking in the lineup in front of me, right? So they're managing all of that, and all of that is happening in the hotel room. They're talking about nonviolence. They're talking about turnout, right? As organizers, like, how many people are we expecting? How many churches have committed and signed up? Do we have some synagogues on deck? What about the white Catholics? Has anybody talked to Father Mickelson, right? Logistics are happening. Are the Deltas and the AKAs, who's going to make sandwiches? Like, we're going to feed people because we're going to be there all day. Exactly.
All the things.
That's all of the things, right? It's 12:30. The lunch meetings are continued. King is joking, roasting the aides, relaxing in his room, right? They're preparing. 2 to 4. He's resting. He takes a shower. They prepare for dinner. You got Jesse Jackson in the room. You have Ralph David Abernathy in the room. You got Andrew Young in the room. And they're moving, right, in and out of the hotel. This is the critical window. So in the early evening, it's 5:30 p.m. Plans are finalized. They're going to have dinner at Reverend Billy Kyle's home. King is encouraged to dress warmly because the weather is cool. Temperatures drop. 5:55 p.m. He steps onto the second floor balcony outside room 306, leans over the railing and speaks to the people in the courtyard below. There's people in the courtyard below, right below, that he can see that he's having conversations with. He notably tells musician Ben Branch to play Precious Lord, Take My Hand at the rally later that night, which is such a powerful song and just a historical fact and note that I was not aware of. And it is a hymn. It is a long sort of favored and treasured song in the Black Christian tradition, in the Black civil rights tradition. And it is saying, like, I can't do this by myself, right? That we will need the wisdom and the protection and the help of our Lord in order to, like, continue on. 601.
That just hits so hard too, right?
Correct. And it's such a beautiful song too. And it's one of those songs where if you are a medium singer or a trash singer, like myself, then, like, it'll let you sound like you know what you're doing. I really appreciate that.
That's a good song right there, huh?
601, a single rifle shot strikes Dr. King in the lower right jaw. The bullet severs his spinal cord and lodges near his shoulder. Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, everybody rushes to King's side. And also the famous picture that you'll see where people are pointing in the direction where the bullet came from. Later it was identified as 422 South Main Street. 602 to 605, 3 minutes. The police and emergency services are called. King is unconscious, but he's still alive at that time before the ambulance got there. The ambulance gets there at 6:10. And he's placed in the ambulance. He gets to St. Joseph's Hospital 5 minutes later, 6:15. They arrive. It's still not clear to us, but whether or not he was still alive by the time he arrived at St. Joseph's, but he must have been because they performed surgery on him. Tracheotomy, they cracked open his chest in an attempt to save his life. But at 7:05 Central Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is pronounced dead. The cause, a gunshot wound to the head. 7:30 p.m. immediately afterwards, like, the news spreads nationally and internationally. There's no TikTok, no Instagram, no Facebook, no cable news, right? And the word
everybody still knew.
And everybody still knew that night, internationally, globally, right, that riots erupted in more than 100 cities, right? Like, no signal, no group chat, right?
Rage,
and connection, right? People can get this information out, and it is so profoundly, like, it has such an impact on people that, again, over 100 cities, riots that night. President Lyndon B. Johnson addresses the nation later that evening. And I'm blown away. And people go to bed that night knowing that Martin Luther King is killed.
And cities are burning.
And guess what? The sanitation workers are still on strike, and they still don't have a union contract.
So the very next day, like you said, there's cities are burning, sanitation workers are still on strike. Mayor Henry Loeb, still a racist son of a bitch. And a group of clergy go to the mayor of Memphis, Henry Loeb, and ask for a meeting with him to negotiate how to settle the strike, to demand that they settle the strike in light of Dr. King being murdered. And Henry Loeb meets with those clergy, and they, in the course of that meeting, the mayor, the whole time he's meeting with preachers, black preachers, this racist asshole has a shotgun under his desk.
Why? Why?
The fear of black people is hard to understate by racists. The racist fear of black folks is so hard to just really fathom. But this asshole is meeting literally with preachers in suits and ties and probably hats and probably ascots and definitely with a handkerchief in their pockets. And he has a shotgun, waiting in case, in case he wants to slaughter this whole group of ministers. So he doesn't settle. And then April 8th, the day of the march that had been set, the march still happens. And Dr. King's widow, Coretta Scott King, leads the march in place of her husband and has her children, Dexter and Martin III and Yolanda, in the march. Now, this is a march that had previously been attacked by the police. The National Guard has been deployed. There are literally soldiers on the sides of the roads with bayonets drawn, prepared to shoot people. And here is Dr. King's widow choosing to step up and lead the march. And they led this march with no incidents and were able to have a massive march and showing of support of the workers. And then on April 16th of 1968, the city of Memphis agreed to settle the strike and give in to a large number, or a number of the workers' demands, including union recognition, dues checkoff, which means that the union has the right to have their dues deducted from the workers' paychecks rather than having to go hand collect the dues, and wage increases. And that's fairly typical for a first contract. You don't get everything you're demanding in a first contract, but you get your foot in the door. We call it, when I was a union rep, we'd call it, that's the foundation or that's the scaffolding for the house, right? And you just got to get that in place, and then you start building on it, and every contract gets better and better. And I just, it's hard to understate how big of a deal it is for a union to get recognized in the public sector in the Jim Crow South, right? Like, public sector workers, when workers were given the right to join unions legally through federal law back in the 1930s through the Wagner Act, public sector workers were not included in that because they were the workers in the southern states were like, we do not want our workers who work for our cities and all that to be able to join unions, right? And so we will not accept that as part of federal law. And those were the jobs, obviously, that are not coincidentally inhabited by majority black workers, right? And so they knew that they could exclude these workers from the right to organize and join unions. So it all fell to the states, right? And so, of course, you had also what was passed, the Taft-Hartley Act, which gave workers the right to not have to pay dues to a union, and states could pass laws for workers to not have to pay dues to a union that has won recognition at their workplace. And that enabled states across the South to pass what we now know as right to work laws. And those laws were specifically implemented in order to prevent white workers from having to join unions with black workers. And so this victory in Memphis was a earthquake in terms of cracking a very intransigent, violent region of the country that was resisted workers organizing with murder and mayhem and, every means at their disposal. And so this was a massive victory that led to organizing in public sector jobs all across the country. Workers decided they were going to join unions and push for laws to allow workers to join unions. And it sparked a whole movement around the right to organize if you worked for like a city or a county or a state workers. And the beginning of all of that is the Memphis sanitation strike. I mean, all of these jobs in public service working for the state, those jobs are now careers that people retire from and get good benefits from because public sector workers, a group of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, to try to say hell no and drew the line, and they won.
You know what I love about this? And when I think about the current fight for union rights right now, right? Like we both have been union organizers in our career. It definitely informs my identity, right? As a worker and an organizer. But it also sort of informs like my analysis and my worldview and what I think is important for us to know as we get up out of here and as we fight our way out of this moment that we're in, that the sacrifice that Echol and Robert Walker made, the sacrifice that King made was not in vain. Right. And that we still today see the impact. Like you talk about how unprecedented and unheard of for public sector employees to be in unions at the time. You fast forward to today in the year of our Lord 2026, and 1 out of every 3 public sector employees, that's federal, state, and municipal employees, that's cities, counties, state, the federal government. 1 out of 3 workers are in unions today, despite the attacks on workers, despite the attacks on unions. That what the blood that went into the soil, that the seeds of organized labor were planted into, has endured to this day, because 1 out of 3, right? 33% of public employees are in unions today, still fighting for their wages. They still have a voice in their workplace. Meanwhile, only 5% of private sector employees are in our unions. So when people hate on good government jobs, it's not because, right, they got it in blood, right? Like
That's right.
King's blood is spilt on it. Sanitation workers' blood is spilt on it. That's one of the reasons why public employee jobs are still stable and still decent jobs with wages and benefits that people can be proud of and people can actually live a life with dignity. while only 5% of people who are employed in the private sector are in unions, right? Which is also why people think that they're bosses, and people are looking at entrepreneurship and other ways to go about making a living and doing a thing, because we don't have power in our workplaces, particularly if you work in the private sector. So as people are thinking about what are the lessons from the King's Act, like, I'm not a person that's like, oh, this person died for a reason, da 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 da. I mean, he should have been able to grow old, right? He should have been able to see his grandkids. Echol and Robert Walker should have been able to grow old and see their grandchildren, right? But they did not die in vain, right? So I feel like it's really important. One of the other things I wanted to point out was, like, people were activated. People got active after the bad thing happened. I want to shout out Congressman John Conyers again. 4 days after King was assassinated, on April 8th, was the first time that he introduced the bill to make King's birthday a federal holiday. It was dismissed at the time as divisive, right? They tried to frame King as a troublemaker. At the time, he was known as the most dangerous man in America. They called him a communist. J. Edgar Hoover, secret black man, secret gay man, definitely a man who hated himself, right? Constantly filming and recording King and others. And so I say that 4 days later, people were not, they mourned. Folks laid on the fainting couch for a little bit, and then they got active. And it took 15 years for the King holiday to become a federal holiday. And it took until the year 2000 until the King holiday was celebrated nationwide. But it feels really, really, really important to understand all of the things that led to us having this day off, which I'm quite grateful for. Thank you for the federal holiday. Even though I'm pretty sure the demand in response to Juneteenth, the demand for King's holiday was like, the state should stop killing Black people. The state should stop killing us so that people can grow old and live a good life. But instead, like, the response tends to be sometimes, how about a holiday? How about a federal holiday? I jokingly refer to them as hush puppies. And y'all know the story about...
you got to tell the story of the hush puppies. Everybody needs to know the story of the hush puppies.
Right. Now, there are a number of different variations. So y'all get in the comments and let us know if you've heard this story before. But my understanding is that people who were leading folks to safety on the Underground Railroad would take these, bring with them fried cornmeal. And it was a way to placate the dogs so that the dogs wouldn't alert these crackers to the fact that people were trying to escape. And that it was literally like, take a little small piece of cornmeal, toss it to the dog and hush puppy so that they can shut the fuck up so that people can escape. And when I think about that, I think holidays are important. Rituals are important. It's how we build culture. But one of the intermediate steps towards us winning the thing that we need is the state trying to give us some shit to placate us, as opposed to doing the thing that people asked for. And so after 15 years and in the face of increasing demand, in the face of a revolutionary campaign by Mr. Stevland Hardaway Morris, like Stevie, also AKA Stevie Wonder, one of my favorite artists, one of my favorite musicians, what we now refer to as the Black Happy Birthday song, right, is in fact a protest song. And a protest song as a part of a larger campaign that was structured by Stevie Wonder and others to recognize and to acknowledge the gift that MLK's life was to us. So by the late 1970s, King had been assassinated for over a decade. The bill to establish his birthday as a federal holiday was introduced 4 days after he was assassinated. And Wonder did not write the song just to celebrate King's birthday. He wrote it to force America to reckon with why it refused to honor him. And it was released on his 1980 album, Hotter Than July. In his own words, he wrote it explicitly as a pressure tactic on Congress, a mass movement organizing tool, and a way to make remembering King unavoidable in popular culture. And so, yeah, whenever you're at your favorite diner or a restaurant and you hear Black people singing a version of Happy Birthday that you're not quite familiar with, know that that's a protest song, and not just some other cool shit that you don't know about.
That just blows me away because that song is just, it's everywhere. Like it's ubiquitous. And
correct.
But yeah, the history of this song, like really shaming Ronald Reagan, into making the King holiday a federal holiday. And I just want to point out that in terms of the hush puppy thing is the King holiday was a demand of the movement as opposed to,
correct.
John Conyers proposed that holiday. And so it's a little bit different but they gave us the concession at the time they gave us the concession was a hush puppy.
Right. It wasn't in 1983 when Reagan signed the bill. It was because the organizing hadn't stopped. Right. The demands for wages, the demands for the police to stop killing us, the demands for more seats at the table hadn't stopped. And so after 15 years, the bill was introduced in Congress every year, every session for 15 years. And so when Reagan signed it in 83, it was a hush puppy. But you're right, it is a demand of the movement. But I just tell us, I encourage us to be mindful. Okay. What's your revolutionary song of the day? What's your revolutionary song related to the King holiday?
Well, and it's kind of funny because we're talking about the hush puppy stuff. It's like one of the aspects of the King holiday becoming a federal holiday was that there was multiple states who refused to recognize the King holiday. And one of those states was Arizona. And so when I was a teenager, there was a controversy because Arizona basically came out publicly saying they weren't going to declare the King holiday as a state holiday. And they gave all these, obviously racist bullshit reasons why they were not doing it. And it just infuriated people all over the country. And one of my favorite bands at the time, Public Enemy, wrote a song called By the Time I Get to Arizona. And back in the day, you had MTV that actually played music videos. And so on MTV, you had a video that was done By the Time I Get to Arizona, so for people that don't know, Public Enemy had an entourage that would accompany them on stage called the S1Ws, the Security of the First World. And they were dressed up basically in military fatigues and berets and sunglasses, basically kind of a Black Panther-ish, radical militant look. And so in the video, the S1Ws are sent to Arizona and they end up attacking the governor's mansion. And it enraged people. The bad guys were seriously offended. The pearl clutching was just off the chain. All kinds of racist tropes were out there. And but it was also a song that really struck young people as you should be pissed off when someone disrespects Dr. King and Martin Luther King. And I think it really helped young white folks who were just sort of were connecting to new ideas through music. It helped the young people really understand the nature of the King holiday and the nature of the civil rights movement. It was one of the things that provoked, a lot of us to start looking at and reading about the civil rights movement. And so, hats off, Chuck D, Flavor Flav. You guys, it was one of my formative songs. So yeah, by the time I get to Arizona by Public Enemy, check it out.
And to listen to these songs and more songs on our Fire MLK Day playlist, please click the link in our show notes.
So this has been a blast. I've had a lot of fun. This is the first one. Knew it was going to be fun, but this has really been great. Do you have a good time, Insay?
I did. I'm excited. I want to do more. I want to tell better stories. I want to put a battery in people's backs. I want to challenge narratives, and I really want to talk about what actually can get done when working people link up. So I'm looking forward to it. Also, the South Bend has something to say, that there's so much wisdom, game, strategy, joy to be found in hearing Southern stories and learning from Southern people. So super happy to be doing this with you.
Absolutely. It's going to be so much fun. And as the South goes, so goes the nation, as they say.
Agreed. If you like or enjoy our hot takes that are really just facts, feel free to follow us on all the platforms, Instagram, Apple Podcasts, etc. We'll be back to share more stories with you. Again, I'm Ensei.
I'm Eric.
And this has been the Roots and Roots podcast. Peace.
Which side are you on?